You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thwart, Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Ava Reid on the show with me. She has an amazing new fantasy novel. It's called The Wolf and the Woodsman, and what an amazing book. You guys are going to love this. I just know it. Ava, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. I'm excited to have you. Ava, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
So I think that I was really lucky in the sense that I grew up in the perfect era that was post-dial-up modem, but where fan culture on the internet was like really starting to take off. So I remember going into my family's like computer room, because that was a thing that everyone had back then,
Right.
in the early 2000s, with a giant like Mac desktop with a really fat back. And I remember just going online and seeing all of this fan content, fan art, fan fiction, obviously, and being so overwhelmed and so happy that this community existed. And I think that was the first time, and I think this is probably true of a lot of writers of my kind of generation, that like the world of fan fiction was kind of my way into storytelling that eventually led to original fiction.
So, is it fair to say that you were a bookish kid? Were you one of those, kids who walked around with their nose in a book all the time?
Yes, absolutely. Like walking back from the Barnes and Noble with my mom, I would have my nose in the book and like almost crash into like the lamppost because I was just too busy reading.
So, Ava, what if you could pinpoint, if you could put your finger on a particular book or a series of books, or maybe it was an author that kind of opened your mind to the possibility that a book could transport you to another place, who or what would that be?
So when I was around 10 or 11, I was obsessed with the Warrior Cats books by Aaron Hunter, which, if you haven't heard of them, it's a middle grade series, but it's basically about these very anthropomorphized feral cats who live in the forest, and they live in different clans, and they have, this culture and this society, and they fight each other. It's actually a very, very dark series for middle grade. It's kind of like Watership Down, but with cats. And I was obsessed with this. I didn't even have a cat, but I just really, really loved this series. And it's really funny because my editor, who's working with me on my YA debut, is actually the one who edits these books now. They're still coming out years and years later. And that, I think, was my first big kind of book that just took over my life, and it was just a complete obsession for me.
Love it. So, we talk a lot on the show about the path from someone who knows that they are a storyteller and desires to one day write something of their own, completely unique, and put it out to the world, and the obstacles that are in the path for that writer along the line. And maybe obstacle is not the right word, but there are challenges. There's a little thing called life that happens, and bills that need to be paid, and people that depend on us, and all of that, and all of those things, and rightfully so, take up place, that might occupy where we might tell stories. So I know that you were born in Manhattan and raised right across the river. And you now, and I'm leaving out a whole lot of steps, but now you work for an AI robotics startup. Is that
I
right?
did actually. I'm not there anymore, but that was my last kind of real person job aside from being an author. Yeah.
Which makes perfect sense for someone that wants to write the kind of fantasy that you do.
Mhm.
What was it that led you down that path? Because I know that your study was on uh, religion and ethno nationalism, and then you've
Mhm.
also worked for a senator.
Yeah,
Y-
I've I've had a lot of different, very different kind of job experiences. So basically, I moved out to Palo Alto because my partner is a PhD student at Stanford, and I at the time had just graduated from undergrad, and I was writing The Wolf and the Woodsman actually, and I just wanted a job that was very, very different from what I was doing and what I was writing, something that wasn't going to kind of take up the creative brain space that I was using for the book. So I was just looking up, and all of the jobs here are at startups. Everything here is a tech startup, and that's just the culture here. So I knew I would end up at one of them, and this one was just by far the most interesting um, of them all. So I took this job, and it was actually only part time, and it was great because I had a lot of time to write. And because it was kind of this like desk job, I could sit at my desk and kind of daydream about my book.
So what? So this story that we're talking about today, this has been something that's been with you for a while. The Wolf and the Woodsman have these characters been with you, and what was it? But I love to hear from people about the beginnings of
Mm-hmm.
things. It's fascinating to me because at one moment in time, none of this existed. None of the characters, the setting, none of it existed, and then either a character walked onto the stage of your mind or you
Mm-hmm.
started thinking of a fantastical setting, and then everything starts kind of evolving, and then in one form or another the wolf and the woodsman exist.
Mm-hmm.
What was that catalyst for you that got all this going?
So it was one really, really specific moment. I remember I had fallen down just like this Wikipedia rabbit hole where I was reading about it was initially for a paper I was writing for one of my classes about kind of modern day Hungarian politics. But I fell down this kind of Wikipedia research rabbit hole, as we're all sometimes want to do.
Oh yeah.
Um, and I started reading about, very, very early Hungarian history when the modern state of Hungary just began to take shape. And the person who's regarded as kind of the founder of the modern Hungarian state is Saint Stephen or Saint István. And I was reading about him, and I came upon just this little, like, kind of throwaway sentence anecdote about how so all of his children kind of died before they became of age. So his heir apparent was his nephew, but his nephew was a pagan, and he didn't want a pagan to inherit the throne. So he had his nephew's eyes stabbed out. And this is just a very throwaway kind of sentence, on this very long Wikipedia article. But that was so, like, that image and that kind of act of like such brutality, that really stuck with me. And I wanted to create a world where something like that could happen, where that was just the reality. This brutality was just normal.
Right. That one of the things that I love about fantasy so much is the politics of it, and the way that the characters interact and the way that societies interact, and it almost lets us explore the things in our own real world, um, but sort of distilled down to what should happen, or the way people should behave, or maybe seeing the kind of the folly of things, but in a simpler way to look at it. Was that something that you were thinking about when writing this? Obviously, you're thinking about what could cause, an event like this to happen. What is it when you start thinking about the politics? Because that's very well defined in this book, and the way that the communities interact with each other. What did you start doing to kind of flesh that out?
Well, I started with, it's interesting. I started just with the idea of a Christianizing country because I thought that was really interesting. You don't really see a lot of that in fantasy, the actual process of a state being formed. Usually in a fantasy book, you'll have these established states and everyone in the state kind of has the same identity and the same sense of patriotism. So I thought it would be interesting to write a fantasy book that was about like the identity crisis of a whole country that was kind of on its way to being formed, and there was a lot of jockeying back and forth about what kind of country this should be, and that was kind of where I started, as I wanted to explore that idea. And it started out as kind of just a Christians versus pagans thing, but then with my background and my family history and just by researching more, I kind of realized what a significant element Jewish people and Jewish history played in Hungary going back to the Middle Ages and even further. So then, once I incorporated that element, things become even more complicated and complex and just really fun.
Looking for a tool to help you visualize your story before the drafting begins? Plot Pens is cloud-based and optimized for any device. There's nothing to download. From the new writer who isn't sure how to tell their story to the veteran who can increase their productivity dramatically, we've had experienced writers lay out a detailed structure for several novels in a series in a matter of a few days. The app takes you through 4 steps of the process: the concept or log line. Make sure you have a solid concept that you can keep coming back to throughout the process. The outline, 12 beats and 3 acts, each has a description of what should be happening with examples. The board, 40 cards. We take the 12 beats and add sub-beats to those, breaking it down even further and being very specific about what should go into each. These also have examples and descriptions. Right. We take those 40 cards and turn them into a to-do list. For a 50,000 word book, it's about 2 cards per chapter roughly. We have a beautiful editor built into the app. You can export your manuscript to a PDF anytime with the click of a button. Let Plot Pens help you visualize your writing project. Use code HANK10 to get 10% off Plot Pens. plotpens.com.
Authors, I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of 1 book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web.
What was it about the pagan society that intrigued you?
I don't think it was necessarily anything. So that's an interesting question. Actually, I think it was the way that Hungarian pre-Christian myth is kind of memorialized in modern day Hungary that was interesting to me. So, you'll have the Turul is this like national icon, like it's been on coins and postage stamps. There's a giant statue of it outside of Buda Palace in Budapest. It's a very important part of modern day Hungarian state identity and personal identity. But it's also, this obviously this pagan kind of creature. So I was really interested in the way that they were able to kind of integrate that into a Christian state, because Christianity is what defines the modern state of Hungary. It's what defines pretty much every modern state in Europe. It's what defines Europe as, the Christian world. So I was interested in how, they could incorporate elements of paganism and still kind of keep the same narrative that this is a Christian country. That was really interesting to me. So I wanted to kind of explore how, the king quite literally takes, small elements, small pieces of the pagan culture and the pagan society, and the pagans literally, he asks for these tithes or these sacrifices, as a way to consolidate his power and as a way to kind of form the identity of this emerging nation.
So when you start thinking about this story and the the societies that are going to make it up and all that, you are working grown up jobs.
Mm-hmm.
and you have a life that you're navigating. Did you start thinking about that the reality that this could become a novel, or did it start as just you kind of sorting these thoughts out in your mind and playing the what if game? When did it, I guess the question, when did it become a novel to you? When did this become a viable story that you were going to see all the way through to the end?
Well, so I started writing at the end of my senior year of college. So then I was 22. And then, I wrote the book and I was thinking about, publication and stuff, but I didn't really know how to go about that. And I found this program called Pitch Wars, which basically, if your book is selected, you're paired up with a published author, and that published author gives you, an edit letter and puts you through this revision process. And in the end, your book is kind of presented in this showcase for agents to, request and to look at. So I think it was the experience of Pitch Wars and working with a mentor who was in the industry and just learning about the industry that made it feel more real to me.
So when you start thinking about the big concepts of the book, when did characters come on the stage for you, and how did you start thinking of, all of these are great ideas and things that I want to explore, but until they affect people,
Mm-hmm.
The reader doesn't have anything to care about. So how did you cast the story, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, well, I always wanted this book to be about the people who don't fit neatly into this kind of aspirational idea of the country. So obviously you have Évike, who is raised in this pagan village, but she has Jewish heritage. So that's something that just doesn't quite fit. She's ostracized in her village. She's an outcast. She has this very fractured identity. Um, much in the way that the country itself still has this kind of fractured identity. And then, when I was thinking about who, the secondary protagonist, who the romantic interest would be, I wanted it to be someone who could relate to that, who had, obviously they have their differences. They're very, very different in some ways, but fundamentally they have that same experience of exclusion, of fractured identity. And that's what brings them together. So I started thinking about, outcast people who don't fit. And that was kind of the genesis of both of their characters, was that idea.
A lot of modern fantasy fits a certain aesthetic. tends to be kind of resemble Middle Ages Europe, specifically, England or France or, like that. This book has a very different feel, and it almost feels like the Grimm fairy tales, or that it has that sort of feel. Was there ever any thought about, where does this world that I'm creating, where does it fit? What is it going to resemble? How will the reader relate to it? Or is this just the world that came out in the writing?
Yeah, I did think a lot about that because obviously, as you've said, the vast majority of fantasy still is this kind of generic Western European medieval setting. And I think that ironically, I felt that it would be sort of limiting to try and write in that because there's so much that's been done in that kind of area that it's really hard to write something that feels new. And I didn't really know of any. I mean, there's obviously been kind of this uptick in Eastern European inspired fantasy books, but they've been mostly, vaguely Slavic, and Hungary has a different history, has a different kind of pre-Christian culture, and that wasn't something that I'd ever really seen explored. And it was a challenge actually to kind of, especially with the Jewish elements, to kind of balance my desire to be like quote unquote authentic and also to make it legible for the vast majority of readers who obviously are not going to be Jewish or Hungarian. So that was hard. And I remember like one specific debate that I had with my editor over whether or not I should like italicize quote unquote foreign words. And he was very against it because he didn't want it to feel like those words were foreign within the context of the book, because they're not. And ultimately, I ended up agreeing with him because obviously, these languages are the languages that are spoken in the book. They're not foreign words. And I think I've gotten, no one that I've seen so far has had, negative feedback on that front, that like, oh, this is just too like dense or whatever, luckily. So I hopefully pulled off the balance correctly.
Well, fantasy is an interesting thing that because like you said, there really are no foreign words in fantasy, because that is another piece of the tapestry that the author has constructed that bring us into the world. Whereas any other genre, you would need to italicize those words. You would need to give people a clue. But fantasy is one of those genres that's just completely immersive, and it's supposed to be that way. Were there other than that example, were there other things that that made you feel, as you were writing it, that this was a world you could inhabit? And I guess to contrast that, were there things that you maybe in the editing process realized that, I need to change this because it might take someone out of the story? Did you wrestle with that fine line that the writer has to walk?
Yeah, I did. And in some sense, and I was lucky that my editor was very, supportive of what I wanted to do, and that I wanted to tell this particular story, and then I wanted to have, specifically this Jewish element in there. And I think the thing that I kind of struggled with most is like, I don't want to kind of, because it is so inspired by real world history, I kind of wanted to be responsible with that, especially because this history is really, really politicized in Hungary. There are a lot of these right-wing ethnic nationalist groups are really like obsessed with pre-Christian history, because it's their kind of way of returning to what they view as like a pure time before, ethnic minorities, before Jews, before immigrants, before the kind of globalization, even though that's, none of that is true, but it's their kind of idealized world. It's their fantasy world. So I was mostly afraid of that kind of backlash, and I have actually gotten a lot of it from those types of people, that this is our world and you can't be a part of it. You can't use these elements. Because I'm a Jewish person, they have a very negative reaction to that, and the idea that I'm somehow like misusing or appropriating their culture, which is something that I've had to deal with a lot, actually.
Do you think it was harder because you are taking a place and a time that that the story is reflective of actual history? Maybe it's definitely not historical fiction. It is a fantasy, but it's a fantasy that is informed by real events. Most fantasy writers will just create completely different worlds and new religions and political factions and all of this. And in the writer's mind, they might be stand-ins for something that they're representing, but maybe the reader would never know that. Was that important to you to for the reader to kind of know what you were talking about, to wear your influences on your sleeve, if as it were?
Yeah, I think that I've tried to be very open about my like not only historical but also like modern day political influences for writing this book. And I don't know if I've talked about this in an interview before, but when I was in Budapest a couple summers ago, I was taking my cab ride back to the airport, and my cab driver was this huge, he was like 6'6", I think. He was enormous. And he had a shaved head, and I could see, because I was behind him in the taxi, that he had this giant arrow cross tattoo with a Tyrol on it. And the arrow cross is the symbol of the Hungarian Nazi party, and the Tyrol is also one of the symbols of that party. So, once that kind of, and you go from going to the Dohanya Street Synagogue, which is the largest synagogue in Europe, and that also hosts a huge Holocaust memorial, and you see all these Holocaust memorials all over the city, and then you get into this cab with this man who has a Nazi tattoo on his head, and it's, once you kind of experience that, it changes the way you want to write the book. I couldn't, get that out of my mind in a real sense when I was writing this book, that the Tyrol and all of these, cultural elements, they're not dead.
Right.
They're still being used. They're still being, manipulated for political purposes. So I was aware of that when I was writing, and that made it both, I think, more challenging, but also more important that I kind of get it right and really be precise in what I wanted to say and the message that I wanted to impart.
Well, the tattoo on the head is that's a pretty bold statement. You can mistakenly get a drunken tattoo on your arm and wear long sleeves. It's happened to plenty of people. But when you go for the tattoo on the head, that's a statement.
Yeah, it's definitely a statement, and it's not uncommon at all, really. I mean, when we were around Budapest, you would see these signs, these like flyers that were "Restore Greater Hungary." You would see stuff like the closed campus of Central European University, which the Prime Minister Viktor Orban had shuttered basically because of this, feud that he has with George Soros, and just his general kind of anti-EU, anti-globalism, anti-intellectual sentiments. So it's all over, it's very real stuff. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to kind of write a book that was entirely, ignorant to that.
So has what does your family think of the book?
No one has read it actually, and that's by intention. No one in my immediate family are really big fantasy readers or big readers in general, and the people in my extended family, I'm just kind of like, this is not really the book that you're gonna be interested in reading. I had my grandma help me with some of the Hebrew, but that's about it. There's just, I mean, it's a pretty bloody, dark book, and there's a lot of capital C content, so I haven't really been eager for them to read it.
So Ava, now that this book is, when people are hearing this, then the book will be on sale everywhere and they can go grab it. But it's a pretty addicting thing to to create stories and to publish them and put them out to the world. What are you working on next? Because I can tell from the passion that went into this book that this is not going to be the only story that we see. What are you working on next?
So I have another book with my adult publisher, with Harper Voyager, coming out next June, and that is, you mentioned Grimm before, so this is a retelling of the Juniper Tree, which is one of Grimm's fairy tales. Not many people know it because it's very bizarre and very dark, and it's about cannibalism. But it's set in the Victorian era Odessa, which is actually where a large portion of my family is from. So I'm really excited about that. It's pretty different from The Wolf and the Woodsman in that it's a more straight kind of gothic horror book. But I think they have a lot in common thematically. So I'm really excited about that. And then I have my young adult debut coming in early 2023, and that is kind of a mystery fantasy romance. It's called A Study in Drowning. It was just announced a couple weeks ago, actually. So I have a couple fun things down the pipe.
I love it. Ava, this the new book is out everywhere now. When people are hearing this, we're going to put links to it in the show notes of this episode. The Wolf and the Woodsman. This is a must-have for your summer reading. Go grab it today. It's in Kindle edition, or if you want to hold actual paper in your hand, you can get the physical copy of it, either with the link that's on the website, or go to your local bookstore and support local businesses. Do it that way. I think most bookstores are open back up now. People are getting back to business, thank God. Or audiobook. You can grab it in audio as well. Have you heard any of the audiobook production?
No, I actually haven't heard any of it, but it's really funny. People have started to, tag me in their reviews of the audiobook version. So I'm really, really curious to hear it. I had a say in the narrator, so I'm very excited to hear her take on it.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear how the audiobook turned out as well. So that'll be fun. That's we can all listen together as it comes out. The Wolf and the Woodsman, available everywhere now. Go grab your copy today. Ava, if people are just learning about you and want to follow you along your writer journey, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram, which is at Ava S. Reid. I'm not really on Twitter. I have a website, avasreid.com, which I try my best to keep up to date. But Instagram is definitely the place to find me.
Fantastic. We'll link that up as well. Ava, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
Authors, if you're looking for a partner to help ensure that your book is the best it can possibly be, look no further than Pico's House. Crystal and her staff make a conscious effort to be critical yet courteous. They also strive to make the business side of things run smoothly so that you can rest easy knowing that your manuscript is in capable hands. Whether you need beta reading, developmental editing, a manuscript critique, line editing, copy editing, or proofreading, Pico's House is the one-stop shop for you. Check them out today at picoshouse.com to get started.